True confession, I am not a lawyer, although I play one on Zoom. But I did get a degree of sorts at the dinner table growing up. So I guess that counts for something. And I think because of that, I have a good insight into the antitrust paradox and the man who wrote it. My father is known to most people as that guy who didn't make it onto the Supreme Court. And some don't even know who he is. One high school student grumbled a few years ago on Twitter, "Who is Robert Bork and why is he on my government AP exam?" Well, I think maybe he's knows now, and a lot of people do. Of course, my father was much more than his Supreme Court nomination. In one particular area of law, antitrust, he was everything. When my father died in 2012, Professor Barack Orbach told the Washington Post, "Antitrust was defined by Robert Bork. I cannot overstate his influence. Any antitrust person would tell you the same thing. Perhaps we will differ on the interpretation of him, but Robert Bork is the single most important person in antitrust in America. Whatever happened in 1987 was insignificant by comparison." So how did it happen that a man many think of first as a judge and a constitutional scholar made arguably his greatest contribution to law in antitrust? Well, Professor Orbach explained it this way, and it's eerily similar to where we find ourselves today in this country. Professor Orbach told the Post, in the 1960s, Bork was concerned the socialists would take over the country through antitrust. He continued, "Antitrust was then about protecting small businesses. He built a framework about how antitrust should be more about economic efficiency than about helping small businesses." This was my father's impetus to write the book that would change America for the better and would contribute to 40 years of economic growth and innovation. I was in the 7th grade then, practicing math by adding up his students' exam scores, as my father worked in his cramped attic study in New Haven to carefully develop and substantiate his concept of antitrust law. I have vivid memories of him. He had just turned 40 when he started work on this book, sitting at a desk that my mother made him from an old door, scribbling with his scripto pencils, mechanical pencils, on the blue-lined pages of his yellow legal pads. A cloud of smoke surrounded him from the Kent cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. This was before the beard. While I was practicing my addition and subtraction, my father was teaching himself calculus. He explained in an article about the same time, "The specialist in antitrust should have as much command of basic price theory as specialists in other fields of law have of forensic medicine or tax accounting or the principles of chemistry." So my father taught himself calculus. The product of his labors was his masterpiece, The Antitrust Paradox, a policy at war with itself. The conclusion of his work was the profound declaration that antitrust law was designed to protect consumers. The Supreme Court had demonstrated this by habitually prohibiting price fixing, which is identified as maximizing the welfare of the consumer as the Sherman Act's defining principle. And yet, antitrust law had become a melange of conflicting decisions that tended to raise prices and support inefficient firms to the detriment of consumers. That was the paradox of his title. Post-1940, the court's antitrust jurisprudence focused on more exotic goals, restricting vertical mergers, tying products together, and other practices that my father's study of economics showed usually posed no harm to consumers. Thus, the court's findings directly contradicted the court's objective. Worse, he saw that antitrust law had fallen under the sway of subjective biases. Justice Louis Brandeis denounced the curse of bigness against small dealers and worthy men. The idea being that it was the job of the law to protect small, often artisanal firms against the predations of larger, more efficient firms. Justice William O. Douglas took up this cudgel in the 60s and 70s, thwacking businesses for being too big or too successful or too corporate. Robert Bork assailed this jurisprudence as early as 1967 when he took to the pages of Fortune magazine to criticize Justice Douglas for punishing Procter & Gamble for its acquisition of Clorox. Douglas's opinion was that the increased efficiencies had raised entry barriers, thus harming competition. My father met this kind of thinking with cool disdain. Like many antitrust opinions he criticized, Douglas has had no real economic analysis. There was no attempt to define raising entry barriers in actual economic terms. If the ease of entry is the hallmark of competition, he wrote, then it should be lawful for Clorox and its rivals to rig prices. After all, the prevailing price of bleach the easier it would be for outside firms to enter the market. What was getting lost here was the obvious question: did the merger or acquisition or practice in question harm or benefit consumers? To provide the means to answer these questions is why I found my father studying calculus late at night. He believed judges have a duty to think through the real world consequences of their jurisprudence in terms of business and economics. Thus, the consumer welfare standard was born as the metric by which to apply a cost-benefit analysis to antitrust law by weighing those costs and benefits from the perspective of the consumer.